Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Glenna Lang, author of Jane Jacobs' First City.
Our guest today is Glenna Lang, and she is the author of this book, Jane Jacobs' First City, Learning from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Glenna Lang, if for people who are not familiar with her, who is Jane Jacobs?
Well, that's a big question, which is answered in the book as well. But to introduce her to those who are probably not familiar with her, she was a very important author. And in 1961 was one of three women who wrote books that changed the world. And one was Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. The other was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And Jane Jacobs wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And it literally changed the world and the way we view cities. Before her book, there were a lot of very enthusiastic officials, architects, even just regular people who thought cities had become degraded, they were falling apart, they were run down, and they didn't appreciate the communities that lay within, and they turned to a process known as urban renewal, which essentially meant bring in the bulldozer and let's get rid of this so-called blight. And they did it not, one single building at a time, but great swaths of mainly inner city neighborhoods, often inhabited by minorities and people of color. And this was going to be the solution to it. And Jane thought about cities carefully. She was kind of a student, in a way, a self-appointed student of cities. And she was writing from New York at that point. And she went into great depth to analyze what makes a city work, what's valuable about cities, and why they should not be destroyed wholesale as they were. There was a time when many people were moving to the suburbs, and that was kind of the 1950s, and Jane thought that was a very, very bad idea. And her book was extremely controversial when it came out. It angered a lot of city officials. I think most notably, the story that people talk about is her theoretical battle with Robert Moses, who was the official in New York City who was in charge of so many agencies. And there's a famous book about him called The Power Broker by
Robert Cato?
That's it. Thank you. And so Jane served a very important purpose. She analyzed the city. She talked about how density was important, how preserving old buildings was important, and walkable cities were important. These are many things that we take for granted today, but they were not qualities of cities that people appreciated.
Well, there are a lot of books published every year. So how is it that her book happened to get such attention and have so much effect?
Well, first of all, the ideas were new. They were based on common sense. They were based on her observations, and she spoke to everybody, not just officials and experts, but she wrote compellingly and thoroughly and she employed a method that anybody could use, which is observation and then her own analysis through common sense.
Was she a person of some importance at the time that she wrote the book, or was she just a person in New York?
That's a good question. She had been an aspiring writer. She had done freelance articles for a lot of magazines and newspapers, the Herald Tribune in New York. And she worked at a magazine herself read by the sort of architecture and design industry called Architectural Forum. So she was not a household name at that point. She was a working woman with a family, and she was an editor and writer for Architectural Forum, which gave her a position, a post, so to speak, from which to view cities and think about cities. And she was reading articles and even agreed with some of them about why urban renewal was necessary. But she had a lifelong personal history of thinking and questioning things and asking very good questions. But she was not well known until her book came out, and there were, battles in the newspaper about her ideas.
How did her book catch on? I mean, from the day it was published, who read it and said, "Oh, this is really something we need to pay attention to"?
Well, the people who cared about cities read it and said, this is really interesting. This is a whole new way of thinking. And then there were people who were infuriated about it. So there was a lot of controversy in the press and the media. And she was someone who always spoke truth to power. So she was very polite and dignified, but she expressed her beliefs.
Was that a cause for her from then on?
Yes. I don't think she was looking to be an activist, but there were issues. She was living in Manhattan, in the neighborhood of Greenwich Village, and which was a wonderful old neighborhood that had been there for years, and it was a very cohesive neighborhood. It was somewhat bohemian, a lot of artists and writers, and one day she was reading the newspaper, and this was soon after her book had come out, and she saw that the city wanted to study her neighborhood for potential urban renewal. Actually, they said they wanted to study it for blight and see whether, it was blighted and therefore no good. And she was shocked because she felt that once they were studying it, their intentions were to demolish it. And there were a lot of people who lived there and loved the neighborhood. And she was a charismatic person, and she had a lot of friends. She was active in the neighborhood. She was visible. She was tall. She was interested in so many things, and she found herself heading up a committee, sort of by popular demand, to take on the city. They organized themselves.
Now, your book is titled Jane Jacobs' First City, Learning from Scranton, Pennsylvania. What caused you to tie the two together?
That's the perfect question. I thank you for it. I see the book as a dual portrait, and I had previously written a book to inspire young adults, I say ages 10 and up, to observe and look at their cities and think about them, and I used Jane Jacobs as a lens through which to view the city. And so it was what I call the first book, which was called Genius of Common Sense, Jane Jacobs and the Death and Life of Great American Cities. So it was really the story of how she wrote the book. And And in doing so and understanding her early life a little bit, but very summarily, I learned a bit about Scranton, and I went to Scranton once to visit it. And I wanted to walk in her footsteps, and I saw her house where she had grown up, and the high school she went to, and the downtown, and it was kind of an aha experience, because I was so taken with the city of Scranton, and suddenly I understood where her ideas came from. She was really largely talking about Scranton, even though she used examples from her Greenwich Village neighborhood and New York. And many people had dismissed her book because they thought it was too much about New York. All her observations were based on it and her own neighborhood. And I could see that was not the case. And I was fascinated by Scranton, which had been very much urban renewed. But you could see the beautiful gems of architecture, and I met enough people to sense the passion and loyalty to Scranton. And after my first book came out, I always wanted to go back to Scranton. And then finally, I had an invitation from the architectural organization, the AIA, and to talk. That one man had learned from a review in the Scranton Times Tribune that this young adult book had come out about Jane Jacobs. As an architect, he was excited about this and learned that she had grown up a few blocks from his house. He invited me to come and speak at the dedication of a plaque that he was having installed in front of her childhood home, and did a little more research, and I was up and running. And I couldn't wait to do more research on Scranton and Jane Jacobs.
For people who are not familiar with Scranton, first of all, because people are seeing this all across Pennsylvania, where is it? Tell us a little bit about it.
It's in northeast Pennsylvania, up in the corner near New York, and it's on the Lackawanna River, which is a sort of lazy, slow river. And it's the anthracite capital, certainly of the U.S. and really of the world. So the main industry had been mining anthracite coal. And believe it or not, it was the third largest city in Pennsylvania when Jane Jacobs, who was then Jane Butzner, that was her maiden name, when she was growing up. And that's something that most people don't realize. It was a city that kind of peaked and and nosedived.
Why was the city located where it is in the first place?
Because of the coal deposits and resources that were discovered. But to go back to the early history, in 1840, it was nothing. It was sort of a crossroads, and there had been an iron forge there and a grist mill, and that was it. But
Slocum Hollow.
Slocum Hollow. It's like Sleepy Hollow. And these three men came from the east, sort of Connecticut by way of New Jersey, and there was the two rivers there, and they decided it would be a great place for building an iron furnace and manufacturing iron, because they had discovered some coal. There was limestone nearby, and they thought there was a lot of iron ore. So they went there, and they were very talented innovators, and they, in just sort of an incredibly short amount of time, built these giant iron furnaces, which you can still go and visit, and established quite a successful business, which just meteorically turned into a large business and gave birth to railroads. So industry grew incredibly quickly there.
Who was Mr. Scranton?
He was well, there was a whole family of Scrantons.
We still have them today.
Yes, these were the early ones. There were the people who had the technology, and they engaged people who knew what they were doing, and they were the financiers. They had the money and the business know-how and the incentive. That they thought it was a great possibility, and it sort of took off, much to their surprise. Scranton incorporated as a borough 16 years later, and 10 years later, in 1866, which had begun in 1840, they had a big city, which is incredible. A lot of the surrounding cities like Wilkes-Barre had been there longer, and they were bigger when they started, and Scranton overtook these other cities. And it was because of the enormous amount of anthracite that they were discovering, the mines they were building.
Why did Jane Jacobs' family end up in Scranton?
Because it was such a promising city. And there's a whole chapter in the book. This was a question that Jane Jacobs pondered all her life. Why would my parents move here? They had nothing to do with Scranton. Her dad was from a farm in rural Virginia. He became a doctor, and because a rich uncle had sponsored him to go to the University of Virginia, and then he had what consists of a residency in Philadelphia. He had gone to Philadelphia, was working in a hospital. Jane's mother was from Bloomsburg, which is more in sort of central and slightly more southern Pennsylvania, 60 miles from Scranton. And so they were a sort of upper middle class family, which had been in Bloomsburg for a very long time. Her father was from a much poorer family, and Jane's mother was a nurse in the same hospital as Dr. Butzner, and they met, and then they had very serious and intense conversations as to where they would move. And Scranton had a reputation for this city of opportunity. Everybody was moving there. It was thriving. I think by the time they moved there, the city had close to 130,000 people, and that's less than 50 years after it was founded. So it was hot, and so it was not a crazy thing. But by the time Jane arrived and was growing up, she's seeing a city that's starting to decline.
And what were the years that she was growing up there?
So she's born in 1916, and that's actually the 50th anniversary of the incorporation of the city, Scranton as a city, and 1917 was the peak. So the year after she's born was the peak of coal production, and it was so valuable because it was important to World War I for the U.S. It powered their submarines, and some incredible tonnage of anthracite coal was coming from Scranton, and but technology is starting to change, and the demand for coal starts going way down by the mid 1920s, when Jane is in grammar school and then high school, and Depression hits.
Now, you say in your book when she was young she liked to wander and explore the city. If you were with her wandering around Scranton as she was growing up and doing her wanderings, what would you have seen?
That's a wonderful question. And there's a kind of imagined walk that she takes. She ends up going to 8th grade downtown and right in the heart of Central City. And so she's living just, 2 blocks from the center of the city. She walks by the beautiful Masonic lodge that was built in the late 1920s in the Art Deco style. She goes by City Hall. This is all within a few blocks of the school. The City Hall, which is a beautiful Victorian stone building. Another fantastic, 2 beautiful post offices in succession, fine department stores, Courthouse Square. Scranton becomes the capital of a newly formed county. It had been part of Luzerne County, where Wilkes-Barre was the capital. People in Scranton got tired of going 20 miles to get a deed from the registry or something, and so they created their own county and called it Lackawanna County. And to celebrate, they built a county courthouse, and also for functional reasons. So there's a beautiful courthouse square right in the heart of downtown, surrounded by green space and very eclectic kind of 1880s architecture. And meanwhile, there are little stores, 1 and 2 story stores of all kinds, from, oh my goodness, clothing stores to bakeries. There are 2 great department stores within 3 blocks of her school. And she was the kind of person who just liked to go to places like the beautiful 1906 train station in the Beaux-Arts style with grand waiting room. And she and her friends would, go into the station. So you have just a variety of stores and people shopping and businesses thriving. It's really lively. And then a few blocks away, there are theaters.
How close?
It's so much rich.
How close to the city and to where she lived would you have found the mines?
Another great question. The mines were not in Central City, but not far. And I'm talking about half a mile, not far from the center of the city. There were mines. And these mines had coal breakers where the coal went up into the air and went down kind of a slide and was sorted by famous breaker boys. But it generated a lot of waste, a lot of sort of rock mixed with coal waste. And this was dumped into piles which became mountains, and they were called culm, C-U-L-M, dumps. And they were gigantic and visible along with the coal breakers. So on her way to high school, and she would literally have walked by one of these giant mines and breakers and a giant coal dump. And these were scattered right on the edge of town. The town grew up around them. I mean, there was not one literally at the crossroads of downtown, but you could not miss them. And you could see them in the distance if there was a big coal dump.
Was her family well-to-do?
I'd say they were middle class, maybe slightly upper middle class. Her father certainly hadn't been. He had a reasonable business as a doctor. He was a physician, a general internist, and her mother was a homemaker. But Jane went to school with children of miners as well. I mean, people lived cheek by jowl. The physical landscape of Scranton is that it's in a fairly, the central city is fairly flat. There's sort of hills around it. It's like the bottom of a big bowl. So you can't really live up on the sides of the bowl. You end up living at the bottom. So people were very close together. and because they needed labor for the mines, Scranton attracted a lot of immigrants. And they were also attracted entrepreneurs as well. But,
what would the ethnic mix have been?
To begin with, so there are sort of, I don't know, Irish, Scottish Protestants who founded the city, like the Scrantons. And but then as they called for workers, they got a lot of Welsh, because there were Welsh coal mines in South Wales, and they had the skills to mine anthracite. And the Irish came looking for work post potato famine, and there were also Germans, a lot of whom became businessmen. So we have the Welsh, Irish, and Germans to begin with. When Jane is growing up, there had recently been and continued to be a lot of Eastern Europeans, Russians, Polish, Lithuanians, and Italians, but all sorts of little countries too, an incredible mix of ethnic groups.
You write in here that Jane recalled her mother warning her that some of the children at the Washington school were not nice, and Jane understood what she meant. She was referring to the Italian, Eastern European, and Irish kids, many of whom lived in the patch. Did she have friends among the various ethnic groups?
Absolutely. And one of her very best friends, whom I got to interview when her friend was 95, and Jane was no longer with us, but her friend Marie van Bergen was of Dutch origin. She was from a downwardly mobile family, and I don't think her mother thought she was high class. Her mother was a real church-going, upstanding woman, and she was in Girl Scouts with Italians, whom I talked to. There are Irish people on the street within her own block. I think there were 10 different nationalities originally, and some of them were first-generation immigrants. And they went to schools together. The schools were very local, but even if they're very local, your neighborhood is not from one culture by any means.
And there was an African-American population in Scranton at the time?
Which was a wonderful discovery, and something that nobody had ever mentioned. Yes, and the African-American population had been there for a long time, since the 1870s. They lived between the two high schools, which were the only high schools in the city, and only a few blocks away. They're right in Central City. There were two high schools that people came from all over, and African Americans attended them. They were always integrated into the city and the schools, and no restrictions. I know that Jane worked with African Americans when she was editor of the Poetry magazine in high school. She's clearly friends with all sorts of people, and in a place that small, you naturally came into contact with people not only from other countries, but people from other races. And her father was not at all prejudiced. I think her mother had come from a small town, and Jane thought she was more old-fashioned. But Jane's approach was to educate her mother and bring home friends from other cultures and other classes, so to speak.
You mentioned Girl Scouts, and you devote a whole chapter to Jane in the Girl Scouts. What was so significant about it that it deserved a whole chapter?
Because it was a huge influence on Jane's life. And that was something that she had never really divulged publicly. But Jane was not a a assiduous student. She didn't like school. She wanted to read. She was really smart. Everybody knew that, but she didn't want to be tied down doing stuff that she wasn't interested in or she felt was taught in a boring way. And I think one of her ways around that was her discovery of the Girl Scouts and how freeing that was, how liberating it was to be in an organization where you could learn by doing. It also brought her, by the age of 10, into contact with other girls around the city. They had badges, I guess they still do today, that they could work towards it. So you could study all sorts of interesting things. But one of their main things, one of the main activities and values that the Girl Scouts taught was observation, that you should be a naturalist and learn to observe nature by looking and writing about it. They kept journals, and also they thought that you should observe. You could apply the same observation skills to examining your city, and she did that. And I think it was wonderful that she could learn by doing in what she felt was a democratic, self-governing organization, and the Girl Scouts also made a real attempt to be inclusive, and I should say they succeeded. You know, they actively recruited girls from poorer families, from at that stage there's much more of a split between Catholics and Protestants, and they made sure to recruit Catholics as well. And I failed to mention that this good friend of Jane's that I interviewed so much, Marie Van Bergen, was Catholic as well. So that was kind of a minority, so to speak, or a different kind of person.
You write in your book that when she was in school, a guest speaker at an assembly lectured the school's children on the proper care of their teeth. When the speaker asked everyone to raise their hand if they promised to brush their teeth morning and noon for the rest of their lives, morning and night for the rest of their lives, Jane considered her father's words and refused to make an unrealistic promise. Feeling convinced about this principle, she urged her schoolmates to join her in not making the promise they would surely break. Back in the classroom, the mortified and infuriated teacher felt Jane had crossed the line. Miss Corcoran could not tolerate such insubordination and promptly expelled her from the classroom. So she had strong opinions. That
was Jane. I love that story because it really demonstrates her personality. I mean, she was not impolite. It demonstrates so many things. It demonstrates that she was a free thinker. That if a teacher said something, she wasn't just going to accept it. She was going to think about it. And her father was a very thoughtful person, obviously very intelligent as well. And he was close to Jane and to all her children, his children. But she had these kind of conversations where they're talking about morals, and she hears his teacher say what she thinks is a ridiculous thing. How could you possibly promise something that you're not going to keep the promise for? But then she has a strong personality, and she's very confident. She's fearless in many ways, and she just, I think, spontaneously responds to the teacher, and you see her there in third grade organizing her class. Raise your hand if you disagree, and she went home and told her mother that the teacher had thrown her out, and her mother was very nice about it and did not reprimand her.
Now,
so she's encouraged.
When she was pretty young, her family moved from Scranton to Dunmore, which is sort of next door. Was Dunmore any different than Scranton?
It's governmentally different because it's not part of Scranton, but as far as being contiguous, it feels like a natural flow when you're walking from one to the other. It doesn't have as big a downtown. It has a little sort of crossroads, and I mean the diversity is still there in Dunmore.
And you say in the book that she dedicated two of her books to the house she lived in Dunmore.
That's right. She loved where she lived. Clearly, she loved her house. She loved her family. I don't think she considered herself to be a Dunmorian. I mean, her family physically lived in Dunmore, but it was really a part of Scranton, and she clearly loved the city and loved her house, which was it was a house that stood out on her block because it was brick, and it was at the slight apex of the hill, and it was a little bigger, but they had a big family at that point.
And the house is still there?
It is, very much so, with a plaque in front saying it was the childhood home of Jane Jacobs.
How many times did you visit Scranton working on this book?
You know, I lost count, but I spent at least 10 years researching this. I felt like a detective or an archaeologist because Scranton had gone so downhill. It had by the time I was working on this, it had there were a lot of records that had been destroyed. It was hard to find information about it. I was literally looking in closets in schools for records, and I went back, I don't know, at least a couple times a year, and I was talking. Meanwhile, I live in the Boston area. Meanwhile, I was interviewing people by phone, and it's wonderful. You can read old newspapers online, and then I had some very kind people who lived in Scranton who've become friends during this process, who would look up things and the library there. So even though I wasn't in Scranton all the time, I was really connected to Scranton, and I can tell you it's hard to give up that connection. It still continues. The research in some ways still goes on.
Where do you find stories like the one about her and the brushing of the teeth?
She actually told that story in an interview, I believe. There's so many things. I think that's correct. But I heard a lot of stories through family members of Jane's. And her son was very, very, very helpful. And he clearly was an assistant to his mother in her writing, or certainly a discussant all the time. And there was one living sibling when I started this project, who was her youngest brother was still alive, and then his wife outlived him, Kay Butzner, and she was a wonderful source. She had grown up in Scranton, and so she was another terrific person who told me lots of stories. And then she had a daughter named Jane after her aunt, and Jane and I went to Scranton, and it was great because her presence sort of opened doors for us, and she was there when we first got to talk to African Americans, so it was great to have a partner, and she loved her aunt. Her eccentric aunt Jane, and had lots of stories as well. So I was really lucky.
Well, Jane's years in Scranton were coincided with the Depression. How did her family feel that, and how did Scranton feel that?
Well, Jane left for New York in 1934, so she had experienced the beginning of the Depression. Her father had a much harder time finding work. There were coal strikes leading up to that affected everybody. I learned a lot from Marie Van Bergen about that. Jane talked about rolling up newspapers to make newspaper logs to burn for heat. There were a lot of people out of work. It was tough times, but one important point about Scranton was its wonderful sense of community, both local communities, neighborhoods, and the city as well. And there was a civic unity and a pulling together. I mean, people really came together to help one another during hard times. And the community chest was really important at that point. You know, churches really reached out, churches and synagogues reached out to help people who were less fortunate.
When did Jane's abilities as a writer start to show themselves?
She had her first piece published in a Presbyterian church magazine when she was 10. And her mother actually collected her childhood poems and typed up a book and made copies and submitted it to the Library of Congress where you can see it. So she was an aspiring poet. And that was another thing about Girl Scouts, was they really encouraged literacy. They encouraged reading. They had a great magazine, I think, which has evolved since then, which published things by Girl Scouts and non-Girl Scouts as well. And Jane always wanted to be a writer, first a poet, and then prose as well.
But she never went to college.
So instead of college, she much to her parents' disappointment, she did not want to go to college. She didn't like school and organized learning like that. And they said, well, hey, you better get some skills so you can earn a living. You know, they were in no position or desire to support her. So first she went to secretarial school and learned typing. Really, she was a really fast typist, and stenography. And she got herself a 1-year secretarial degree. And then she had won a couple of poetry contests and had been recognized for her writing skills. And then she wanted to get in what would be the equivalent of an internship today at the morning newspaper in Scranton.
You said she always loved newspapers.
The whole family did. They sat at breakfast and they talked about the stories, and her father had favorite columnists, and he'd say, oh, okay, let's see what so-and-so is saying today. So they love newspapers. I mean, newspapers were a very, very important part of the culture at that point. I mean, she's in the 1920s just living in an era where radio is really breaking through. You know, there's certainly no television. She loves newspapers, and it combines her desires to observe and also write about things. But as a young woman, she's at first relegated to being a reporter on the women's page.
Were there many women reporters at the time?
Very, very few. She's working for the morning paper, the Scranton Republican, and there's an evening paper, the Scranton Times. On the Scranton Times, the daughter of the publisher becomes an important reporter, and she's well known, becomes well known in Scranton in the early 30s. But I think that there's one other person who kind of rises in the ranks, but it's very unusual. And the women reporters are often only on the social beat, they're not given news stories.
Was she allowed to report on hard news at some point?
Eventually, I mean, not eventually. She was only there for 9 months, but after 2 months or so, she's allowed to do, or she's asked to do book reviews and reviews of plays, and she really turns the heads of the male reporters. Wow, who's this person writing? And then she's allowed to do stories, news stories as well. And a few of her stories are byline, so we know that she wrote them. But others you can tell from the writing. And I fortunately, her son had a scrapbook that the newspaper had, I believe. No, I think she had compiled this. She had compiled some of her articles, so I learned which one were hers. But hers were always distinctive. They were more colorful. They were really thoughtful. I mean, the reporting was good in those days, but Jane had a flair for using the right word, or turning a phrase, and yeah.
She left Scranton at a fairly young age to go to New York City.
She always wanted to go to New York. It was the big city. She loved Scranton. I think she felt it got small. It was a little claustrophobic. She was ambitious. She wanted to be a successful writer, and she thought that New York had more opportunities. She had been there at least once as a child when she was 12, and she was just, very knocked out by the city. The scale of New York compared to Scranton is quite a contrast. So that was her ambition, but she had told an editor of an anthologist who had chosen her poem to be in a very special collection, published collection. She had told this editor that her ambition was first to be a reporter, but her intention was then to go to New York. And
you say when she was living in New York, she had a couple of articles in the Herald Tribune, the big newspaper there, and wrote about Scranton quite a bit.
That was during a crisis. That was by the early 1940s. So she arrives in 1934 when she's just 18, and she freelances. One of the things she does is she goes to various districts. New York has various business districts, the fashion industry and all that. And she would walk around and write a piece on that neighborhood, really fascinating, and obscure topics. She wrote one on manhole covers, which was really fun, and what you could learn from them. And then she would submit them to various places. So those were her early articles, and one of the places she submitted freelance articles to was the Herald Tribune. And but in the 1940s, and after the Depression, and we're in World War II, she learns from her friends, actually from the reporting friends, the other fellow reporters, that Scranton's in a terrible plight, because there are some extraordinary numbers of abandoned houses and abandoned factories, and she thinks these buildings would be terrific to attract wartime industry. So she, along with the newspaper, joined this campaign, and this is getting to be a long story, but she goes back to the Tribune and writes some articles about Scranton's plight, and this effort to bring wartime industry to Scranton, and they get published. So,
did she go back to visit Scranton regularly after she moved to New York?
She did, because her mother was there till 1946. Her father had passed away, which was a huge blow. But I'd say there was a kind of a hiatus after her mother left. she kept in touch because her sister-in-law, Kay Butzner, was, her mother still lived there. Kay's mother still lived there. And she gets news of Scranton. I think that's her main connection is through Kay Butzner. And then her career takes off in New York in the late 60s. She moves to Toronto in protest of the Vietnam War. She had 2 sons, and she didn't want them to be drafted. So she gets involved in Toronto and in sort of urban renewal battles there as well. But I think, as you get older, you start thinking about your whole life. And she went to her 50th high school anniversary reunion in 1983. And I think that kind of stimulated her interest in Scranton again, and her wondering about why Scranton worked so well in many ways, and the advantages that Scranton had with its more, or I should say less unwieldy aspect of government, of economy in some ways, the sense of community and civic unity that Scranton engendered.
Now, her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, came out in 1961, so that's over 60 years ago. Is there still a point in reading it today?
Absolutely. And it won't be as shocking because people have absorbed her ideas. We talk about eyes on the street. That's something Jane coined. It's the importance of having people looking out their windows and being aware of what's going on and who's there, and mixed uses was her term that maybe she didn't originate, but she certainly popularized. And a lot of things that people work for today are things that Jane brought to light. So it reinforces things that people know, and she writes in such detail. She talks about what she calls border vacuums, that when 2 neighborhoods or cities are contiguous, where they come together, there's very little of beauty or interest. So I think there's so much to still be learned, and people invoke her, and she's important to them. And I think also her outspokenness, her personality, the beauty of her writing, I think is important as well.
If Jane Jacobs visited Scranton today, what would she think of it?
I think she'd be excited because Scranton really hit rock bottom. Its population was, I think I don't know if I have the era exactly right, but in the 1950s was half of what it was at its peak. So it had lost half of its population. And actually, for the first time, I believe in the last couple of years, Scranton was gaining a lot of residents again, new immigrants. Jane loved the idea of replenishing. I don't know. She realized the value of immigrants and new people, along with keeping people in the city who had allegiance to it. And this is her argument about how to deal with gentrification, which is always an issue. But
what has Scranton done right and done wrong from rock bottom to today?
I think Jane would say, and I agree, that Scranton became too focused on its mining, too dependent on a single economy, especially of a renewable resource. So some of the mines were getting mined out, along with the shift to oil and other fuels. So that was something that was very unfortunate, and she was well aware of. But I think what they've done right is they stopped tearing down their buildings, and it's partly Jane's intervention, or in a way, I mean, she really she tried to do something about their exploding of their epicenter in the 1990s for a mall right at the crossroads of the city. So she got involved in that. I think there were people who wanted to preserve the architecture, but also it's attracting new immigrants who are looking for opportunity and to buy houses, who are not well-to-do, and they join churches, they establish churches and other organizations. They're an asset with their small businesses. Lots of new small businesses that had blossomed. The pandemic is hurting everybody, but hopefully it will bounce back. So I think this influx of people, the continuity of old timers, I think people in Scranton are beginning to discover their history, and that was one purpose of the book, to appreciate what the city had once been and could be again. And I think she would be happy to see that it's helping people to recognize that medium-sized cities are a valuable and viable place to live, where you don't have the giant, amorphous, in many ways unmanageable, giant cities like New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta, and medium-sized cities hold a promise for the future.
That's going to have to be the last word. We're out of time. We've been speaking with Glenna Lang. She is the author of this book, Jane Jacobs' First City, Learning from Scranton, Pennsylvania. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me and for your wonderful questions.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.